Commerce, Justice, Science, Appropriations Subcommittee will come to order. It's a privilege to us to welcome today Chuck Rosenberg, Acting Administrator of the Drug Enforcement Administration, to present the fiscal year 2017 DEA budget request. The DEA leads the fight nationwide to fight the supply of illegal drugs and is a key partner in tackling demand. The DEA's unique position in law enforcement enables it to address many different threats, including heroin, prescription, and opioid abuse, methamphetamine and marijuana production and abuse, regulating doctors, pharmacies, and manufacturers, combating drug cartels, violent gangs, organized crime, Taliban drug lords, and narco-terrorists. Your plate is full, sir, and we really appreciate your service and that of your agents. You have had a tremendous number of challenges in recent years, including international threats, workforce and management challenges, and however, the DEA continues to serve as a bulwark against the criminal forces who use drugs and addiction to damage communities and weaken public institutions, and finance massive criminal and terrorist organizations as well. The committee is immensely grateful to you, sir, and the men and women of the DEA for their contributions to public safety and security, and we intend to help find the resources that DEA needs to carry out its critical work. At the same time, DEA must work within the fiscal reality of tight budgets and must address its workforce and management challenges. Before we proceed, however, let me recognize Mr. Honda for his comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as we begin our final hearing of the season for the CJS subcommittee, I just want to say that I appreciate our collaboration throughout this whole process. I look forward to working together to craft a strong bipartisan CJS appropriations bill that will reflect our mutual interests along with those of our colleagues of the subcommittee. And thank you and welcome, Mr. Administrator Rosenberg. It's a pleasure to have you join us this afternoon to discuss your work and your budget requests. I would also like to personally thank you and the dedicated men and women at the Drug Enforcement Administration who work tirelessly to protect the American people from illegal drug abuse and trafficking. And I would like to especially acknowledge the hard work of Chairman Culberson and Chairman Rogers, who have been real leaders in focusing attention on the opioid epidemic that swept across this nation. They are doing their best to combat this scourge to our constituents and the American people. And with that being said, I'm eager to learn about the DA's thoughts on a number of issues, including the war on drugs, medical marijuana, the use of life-saving drugs to counter opioids and other narcotic overdoses. Thank you again, Administrator Rosenberg, and I look forward to hearing your testimony, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Honda. I recognize the Chairman of the full committee, Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator, welcome to the hearing. I think this is your first appearance before the committee. I recall our conversation in December before the omnibus discussing our shared commitment to combating the drug abuse plague that has hit my home state and the country far too long. Your vast experience across justice suits you well, I think, for your role at DEA. The men and women of DEA serve admirably in an increasingly trying time for narcotics officers nationwide. Their service on the front lines of the war on drug trafficking, whether along our southern border or the hills of Appalachia, is an essential part of the broader national security and public safety campaign. I look forward to working with you to build upon your success. In that vein, let me applaud you for your discipline in assembling a responsible budget request this year, seeking a 1% increase to $2.1 billion. So often agencies come to us with dream budgets that simply aren't realistic. But your request gives us a clear picture of your priorities: cybersecurity, your new 360 strategy, and maintaining adequate staffing levels. As we talked a few months ago, the drug epidemic has evolved at an alarming rate since I first came to Congress. Since then, the abuse of prescription painkillers and heroin have ravaged our small Appalachian communities. We fought back with a holistic approach that incorporates both law enforcement and prevention. As you know, an organization called UNITE, Unlawful Narcotics Investigations, Treatment, Education, has done phenomenal work in Kentucky with this very strategy. In addition to their important work engaging with our youth to prevent substance abuse on the front end, they forged robust partnerships with local and federal law enforcement agencies, especially DEA, to put over 4,300 drug pushers in jail, crack down on unscrupulous doctors, and confiscate hundreds of thousands of diverted prescription drugs. In fact, at this very moment, 3 UNITE Task Force agents are assigned to DEA interdiction units in eastern Kentucky. Together, UNITE and DEA have had tremendous success with their take-back days, seizing over 6 tons of drugs nationwide since 2012, and more than 1,800 pounds just last September. I have no doubt that replicating this type of effort in your new 360 strategy, pilot cities, will yield positive results. And I'm grateful that you will be providing additional insight about this initiative at Operation Unite's National Prescription Drug Abuse and Heroin Summit in Atlanta next week. We look forward to hearing from you there. The importance of taking UNITE's holistic approach to the national stage has never been more clear. More than 100 people each day die from opioid and heroin overdoses alone, more than we can fit in this room. We have to redouble our efforts to stop this needless loss of life and take back our communities. DEA, of course, is a big part of that. As I mentioned, I'm greatly interested in this new 360 strategy, which will focus on driving down the surge of heroin by attacking the supply chain, strengthening diversion control, and partnering with community leaders. What I particularly appreciate about this initiative is its holistic approach. I've repeatedly advocated for a broad 3-pronged strategy in which enforcement, treatment, and education work in unison to combat substance abuse. It would be easy to arrest the drug dealers victimizing our citizens and claim victory. But the reality is much more complex, of course. By broadening your partnerships with communities across the nation, you'll be working hand in hand with the people closest to the problem. Before I conclude, Mr. Director, I would be remiss if I did not express my continued disbelief at the administration's disregard for the Controlled Substances Act. Despite changes in popular perception in some parts of the country, marijuana remains an addictive drug with significant short and long-term health consequences to its users. And it's against federal law to consume, possess, or distribute marijuana. Former Deputy Administrator Harrigan himself said that the administration should not abandon the science regarding this harmful drug. And I look forward to hearing what the DEA is doing under your watch to fully enforce that law. Thank you again for you and your agents for your steadfast dedication to the problem. Look forward to hearing from you.
Administration Rosenberg, you're recognized for an opening statement, and without objection, your written statement will be entered into the record in its entirety, and I welcome your testimony to the extent you can summarize it within 5 minutes. Would be terrific. Thank you very much.
I believe I can. Thank you, Chairman Culberson, Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Honda, members of the committee. It's a privilege and a pleasure to be here today. It's also a privilege and a pleasure to represent the DEA. I've spent my professional adult life in federal law enforcement, but I am new to drug enforcement, and so I recognize that I have a ton to learn. One way I've tried to do that is by visiting our men and women around the country. I've been to 48 offices so far in my first 10 months. I've learned a few things that have surprised me, a few things that have pleased me, a few things that have shocked me. I had no idea when I started this, despite my background in federal law enforcement that 47,000 people died last year of a drug overdose. You alluded to that, Chairman Rogers. About half of that number from opioids, another 8,000 or so from heroin, about 130 people a day. If we meet for 2 hours, that'll be another 10 people dead of a drug overdose somewhere in the United States. Those numbers are absolutely stunning. And I think sometimes in our lexicon, we use words of exaggerated meaning, historic or unprecedented or unique. But I actually think this is an epidemic. I think that's precisely what it is, an epidemic. And as you pointed out, Chairman Rogers, we need a holistic approach to it. We have to do our law enforcement thing. We have to attack the supply side. But even when I was a baby assistant U.S. attorney in the Eastern District of Virginia, I never believed that we would prosecute or jail or enforce our way out of this mess. And I believe that as firmly today as I did then. We need to approach it in a 360-degree holistic way, meaning through diversion, making sure that the drugs that are in the legitimate chain of commerce stay in the legitimate chain of commerce, and of course through education and treatment and prevention, something we historically have not paid enough attention to. And I'm trying to change that, albeit within a limited budget. We are 5% of the world's population as Americans and consume 99% of the world's hydrocodone. And so I guess we shouldn't be surprised that the connection between pills and heroin is as strong as it is. 4 out of 5 heroin users started on pills, and many folks who use or abuse pills get it from a medicine cabinet or a friend or an aunt or an uncle or a relative. And that's why we have reinstituted our national take-back program. You gave the aggregate numbers. I'll break it down a little bit if I may. But in September of last year, we took in 749,000 pounds of unwanted and expired drugs. Now, by some estimates, only 10% or so are opioids. But even if that's true, and even if it's quote-unquote only 10%, that's still about 74,000 pounds of opioids. So we think we're making a difference. We're going to continue these programs. Our next take-back will be April 30th of this year, so not that far away, about 5 weeks. And if it's like our last take-back program, it'll be in 5,000 communities around the country. We have a lot to do, and we have less to do it with. Over the last 5 years, we've lost about 860 people. About 350 of those are special agents. So we have made I think, reasonable and modest request. I think the President's budget for the DEA is a good one, and we will continue to spend the money that you give to us, I hope wisely and carefully, but we have a lot to do. I am grateful for the opportunity to be here. I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Administrator Rosenberg. If I could, wanted to ask you about the Inspector General had documented a serious problem that you inherited, and I know you've dealt with. You inherited an agency that was troubled by reports of misconduct and unprofessional behavior. The DOJ Inspector General made recommendations for policy and management improvements, and the Inspector General has reported that all of the issues have been resolved or closed, and we certainly appreciate that under your leadership. Of course, we expect the highest standard of professional conduct by all of our law enforcement agencies, and if you could, sir, please describe your actions to address system or personnel problems that contributed to the types of misconduct that the OIG found.
Thank you for your question, Mr. Chairman. We've done a number of things, I believe, to address it, both the specific recommendations and more broadly some process issues that I found. Let me speak to the latter first, if you don't mind. For instance, our OPR staffing was at about 50%. It was too small and too slow in order to move cases, to investigate cases, and ultimately to adjudicate cases internally. We needed to beef up that staffing, and we have. We're now at about 90%. As well, we've streamlined, I believe, the process for adjudication. Our deciding officials, the folks who receive the reports and the recommendations initially from OPR, we've increased their staffing levels as well. And we've taken smaller cases, I don't mean unimportant, but I mean smaller ones, and moved that to our Board of Professional Conduct for its resolution, freeing up our deciding officials to handle the most serious misconduct cases in the agency. The good news is that we have relatively few of those. The other good news is that we're moving them more quickly. So the number of cases we have pending for removal, I believe, are down to a very small number. We had to look at the entire process to see where we had workflow issues and process issues. We also issued new standards of conduct, Mr. Chairman, making it clear that off-duty conduct, or at least certain off-duty conduct, was prohibited. One of the things the IG had pointed out is that agents who had solicited prostitution abroad were not dealt with swiftly and appropriately. We have made solicitation of prostitution off-duty, on-duty, whether it's in a jurisdiction that permits prostitution or not, a removable offense for the first instance. So I think we've done a number of things, Mr. Chairman. We have more to do.
We're going to have a series of votes coming up here in just a few minutes, so I'd like, if I could, to move on to Mr. Honda, and then we'll try to get through these as many questions as we can
Yes,
before we
sir.
recess.
Thank you. Got it? Thank you. Administrator Rosenberg, like many of my colleagues, I am concerned about the surge in opioid and heroin abuse and overdoses. And one medication, naloxone, has been shown to be effective in reversing an overdose if given promptly. In many jurisdictions, first responders are now routinely carrying this medication. And I know that the Food and Drug Administration evaluates drugs from a safety and efficacy perspective. From the viewpoint of the DAA, would you have any concerns with making this drug available over the counter or by simply asking a pharmacist?
It's a good question. I've thought a lot about this, Mr. Honda. I know, let me just add something first before I answer your question. We've trained our own people on the administration of naloxone. 64 of our DEA special agents / EMTs have been trained to administer naloxone. And as part of their training, and this may answer your question in part, they were also trained on CPR and on the use of defibrillators, because as I understand it, sometimes cardiac incidents can attend the administration of naloxone. So whether or not it's appropriate for over-the-counter without a prescription distribution, I don't know, but I do know that when we approached it as an agency, we wanted to make sure that our men and women were trained not just on the administration of naloxone, but also for responding to cardiac events that may attend the administration of naloxone. So I think it's worth looking at. I love the idea of getting naloxone out there. I think that's terrific. I just want to make sure people are properly trained for any consequence that may flow from its use.
Are there processes or steps that you would recommend in terms of moving into the arena, for instance, having the first responders and other public safety officers being trained as the DEA and first responders are on a larger scale?
I think that would be wonderful. The more people we can have trained to administer it, the better. And we're going to do something within DEA, taking the first 64 folks that we've trained and have them train additional people in our offices around the country. So getting that out there is a good thing. I just want to make sure we take prudent steps to ensure that folks who are administering it can administer it and attend to all of its consequences. So good thing, but we should be careful about how we go about putting it in the hands of people who would use it.
Last question. In terms of side effects and its use, you said in use in conjunction with cardiac arrest, but does naloxone have any other uses other than just cardiac arrest? I mean, drug overdose seems to me
Sorry.
a cessation of bodily functions.
I'm sorry, I wasn't clear, sir. What I mean is its primary use is to counter the opioid overdose. A side consequence, a side effect, is occasionally a cardiac incident. And so when we train people on how to administer naloxone, we also want them to be trained to handle any cardiac event that may also occur. I'm sorry, I didn't explain that very well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Chairman, pardon my voice, but I guess the allergies are winning. Let me talk to you about your 360 strategy for a moment. As I mentioned earlier, I'm thrilled to see DEA tailoring your approach to the ever-evolving prescription drug and heroin epidemic. When OxyContin appeared in my district in the late 90s, we didn't see much heroin in circulation. But the last decade, that's changed dramatically. National heroin use has increased by 63%. Overdoses have gone through the roof. I think due a lot to the emergence of fentanyl as a use with heroin. For the benefit of our group here today, why don't you give us an overview of how your 360 approach differs from your normal current operational strategy?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The idea here is to attack a problem from all sides. My friend Director Comey at the FBI talked about the need to fill the time and space that you create in the community when you have an enforcement operation. And that's precisely what 360 is all about. We have to continue our traditional law enforcement supply side work. That is sort of the heart and soul of who we are and what we are at the DEA. But in addition, we have to recognize that we create time and space in the community when we put bad guys in jail for distributing drugs. And so that's the rest of 360. Treatment, education, all go to the demand reduction leg of the stool. If we don't start knocking down the demand side, we can't possibly win against the supply side. Then the other part, of course, is diversion, making sure that folks who need opioids can get them, but that they're prescribed in a thoughtful way, in a limited way, and that we have something to do with what remains, that they don't find their way into the stream of commerce. Because here's the problem. Opioids are highly effective, but they're also highly addictive. And if you get addicted to an opioid, and I'm sure you see way too much of this in your home state, buying that pill on the street is very expensive. A 30 milligram pill of hydrocodone or oxycodone, for instance, would go for about $30. The heroin or fentanyl substitute is much, much cheaper. And so we see this migration, if you will, of folks hooked on pills to heroin. And the old stigma of having to inject heroin, that's a thing of the past. Now you can smoke it or snort it. You can ingest it in different ways. You don't need a needle. And it's simply widely available, more potent, and much cheaper than it ever has been before. So the approach is keep the pills within the legitimate stream of commerce, attack the supply side, and try to reduce demand. That's the idea behind 360. And that's what I plan to talk about at the summit next week, because it's something that's really important to me and has been for a long time.
Well, I really appreciate you coming to the summit. This is the 5th straight year that Unite has put this on nationally. We've got a tremendous lineup of speakers, including yours, which I deeply appreciate.
I think I'm going to bring the average down, sir.
I don't think so. At 3:45, we're going to learn of another speaker that's going to be at our conference. I'll wait to announce that at 3:45, but I think you'll be pleasantly surprised by that speaker. 360 will start in 4 cities: Pittsburgh, St. Louis, West Memphis, Arkansas, and Milwaukee. How did you come by those 4?
We looked at cities generally that had an uptick in crime, cities where we thought that were large cities but not enormous cities, and cities where we thought we could make an immediate difference. We're looking now at another round of cities, and we're trying to approach this sort of driven as much by statistics as we possibly can. Where do they need us? Where has the problem gotten worse? Where can we make a difference? I wouldn't call it an exact science, sir, But it's an attempt to put limited resources where we can make a difference.
Do you see that expanding in time to rural locations?
I do if we have the resources. I'd love to be in more cities. The feedback initially from the first 4 pilot cities has been good, so I would love to expand it if I can.
Congratulations on your take-back programs. As you know and have said, expired medications or unused drugs often stay in the back of cabinets for months at a time or even years. More than 70% of people who first misuse prescription drugs get them from the medicine cabinet of the family or from friends or relatives, or simply take them without asking. Local law enforcement agencies simply don't have the capacity or the authority, really, to take back these unwanted meds. Unite in Kentucky, though, did this beginning 7, 8 years ago, and it works. But DEA now has taken that nationwide. And I'm pleased that in September, you held your 10th Take-Back Day around the country. Do you plan to continue that program even more authoritatively?
Well, yes, sir. For this year, we plan to do it twice. Our 11th National Take Back will be April 30th of 2016, and I anticipate that will be in 5,000 communities again around the country. Our second Take Back in 2016 will likely be in October, certainly sometime in the fall, and I'm hoping we build on the success. One thing I should add, in addition to taking in about 749,000 pounds of unwanted drugs, and this is important, is the fact that we do it anonymously. We don't read labels, we don't take leads off of those things. If you want to bring in Bengay or aspirin or opioids, whatever you want to dump in, we'll take it. But people need to know that they do so anonymously, because we have to encourage people to empty out those cabinets that you spoke about.
In my area of Kentucky, Unite started a take-back program several years ago. Now we've got all of the police departments and sheriff's offices as depositories, and they've collected tons upon tons of take-back drugs. And then the sheriff and the police departments would utilize a Kentucky National Guard incinerator on wheels, and they would burn the drugs periodically at different locations as they needed, until EPA comes along and says that violates the atmosphere. So they took that away. Can you help us with that?
Well, I think the way we can help is that we've worked through those logistics with EPA, and so when we hold these take-back days, we can gather the stuff from various departments and have it incinerated according to regulation. With respect to the specific EPA regulations, though, sir, I don't know enough about it. I do know that we're able to help the local police departments that gather and collect by holding our own take-back days.
Another example of your friendly EPA doing good for America. I yield.
Mrs. Lloyd.
Thank you. And welcome, Administrator Rosenberg.
Thank you.
I, too, you can see that we're all on similar wavelengths. I am very concerned about the growing use of synthetic and so-called designer drugs, like bath salts, jewelry cleaner, herbal incense. They pose a serious public health concern and can cause vomiting, anxiety, agitation, irritability, seizures, hallucinations, heart problems, elevated blood pressure, loss of consciousness, significant orphan damage, as well as overdose deaths. Now, I understand that the problem is compounded as criminals constantly introduce new chemical variations. It seems to me it's a game of whack-a-mole. Last fall, the DEA and other local law enforcement partners, including the Rockland County Sheriff's Office, halted a criminal operation which operated in all 5 boroughs of New York City, allegedly involving the unlawful importation of at least 100 kilograms of illegal synthetic compounds, an amount sufficient to produce approximately 1,300 kilograms of dried product, or approximately 260,000 retail packets. Each of these 260,000 packets of synthetic marijuana had the potential to send someone's family member to the hospital or worse. In addition to the public health toll, criminal enterprises like this have been found to have links to violent conflicts and even terrorist activity. Can you share with us briefly the challenges in investigating these cases and whether DEA has enough authority under current law to prohibit these substances which are continuously changing?
Congresswoman, thank you. I think your description of this as whack-a-mole is apt, but it's a very dangerous whack-a-mole game. It isn't the one that you find at the county fair. This is much, much worse. There are several classes of synthetics. Synthetic marijuana is a bit of a misnomer. It really is not marijuana. It's rather, I think, vile and nefarious that it's marketed that way, so people will think it's not that bad. But it really is, as someone has described, Russian roulette, although that doesn't quite work either, because Russian roulette had one bullet in the chamber, and this has several bullets in the chamber. The list of consequences that you described are all accurate, but we're obviously also seeing kids dying from this stuff. And what makes it so vile is that the folks who are building this stuff, for lack of a better word, in their labs only have to tweak a molecule or two from time to time to stay ahead of enforcement. We have the ability to emergency schedule some of these compounds, but at one point, not so long ago, we were seeing 2 or 3 new synthetic drugs a week. That number is now down to 1 or 2 a week, which still essentially precludes us from catching up. So it's a race we can't win. It is whack-a-mole, but it's also a race we can't win. Also, sadly, it's as easy as sitting down at your computer and ordering this poison off of the internet. And with respect to synthetic cannabinoids, what some people, I think, mistakenly call synthetic marijuana, you'll find this stuff in shiny foil packages, with colorful characters on the outside, clearly marketed to young adults, not even young adults, young teens, young kids. You can buy them in roadside stores or convenience stores or just a few dollars. And one dose, one time, is enough to kill you because you don't know what's in it. And so we're seeing the synthetic cannabinoids, which are, I guess, pharmacologically related to the THC in marijuana. We're seeing the synthetic cathinones, which you described, which are similar in effect to stimulants, methamphetamine. Flakka falls under that, and I know there's an enormous problem in New York and around the country with flakka, but flakka is just one type, and this poison is marketed to kids. So we have emergency scheduling authority. In 2012, I believe, Congress legislatively scheduled a number of synthetic compounds, and that's a good way to attack the problem because you can go faster than I can go. We need help.
Thank you. Like many of the members of this committee, especially Chairman Rogers, who has been really a leader for us all, I too am concerned with the rise in opiate addiction. And it seems to me that there are 2 fronts to this war, which is affecting every region of the country. The first is making sure that prescription drugs aren't overprescribed, which we've talked about, and abused domestically. The second is curbing the flow of heroin and other opioids from abroad. And in your statement, you identify Mexican cartels as posing the greatest drug threat to the United States. DEA has one of the largest overseas presence of any law enforcement agency with offices around the world, allowing you to work with foreign law enforcement on drug investigations and share intelligence. I wonder if you could share with us whether this collaboration between the DEA and law enforcement in Mexico is working, And what strategies are you employing with your Mexican counterparts to ensure that when a cartel is disrupted, another cartel doesn't just step right in to meet market demand?
Two very good questions. I'll try and answer them both. First, I should mention probably 98% of our heroin comes out of Mexico. So an enormous problem. But as you noted, we have a very large overseas presence, and we have a large overseas presence in Mexico. We work well and closely with our Mexican counterparts, but when you're working in another country, there are obviously limitations, not just for DEA, but for ATF or FBI or anyone else for that matter. And so we are guests of our Mexican counterparts in Mexico. We do training. We work closely with vetted units there. We've made a number of important inroads. But I come back to a problem that I mentioned in discussion with Chairman Rogers. As long as the demand remains so remarkably high in this country for that poison, they're going to find a way. It's so lucrative. So we have successes, and we continue to have successes. If the DEA is doing its job right, and I hope we are, we're going after the biggest, most violent international cartels and the most violent and dangerous street gangs in the country. But as long as demand remains where it is, Congresswoman, they're going to find a way. So are we working well with our Mexican counterparts? Yes. Is there more to do? Absolutely. But we need help on this side of the border, too.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Congresswoman.
Thank you very much. Mr. Adderholt.
Thank you, Chairman and Director. Administrator Rosenberg, thanks for being here. I know that your colleague, Director Comey, has been very outspoken about the issue of the smartphone encryption and the impact that it's had on law enforcement overall. And I've directed several questions submitted to him about the situation, but I'd like to hear your perspective, and could you share with the committee on this issue and how it's impacting DEA and its work?
Certainly, sir. My view is not different than his, nor is it different from the Attorney General's. It strikes me as odd and dangerous that with a lawful court order, there are places we literally can't go. We also favor strong encryption. The entire United States government and all of its citizens benefit from strong encryption. But it's, as Director Comey has said, as if there was a closet or a room for which there's no entry. And that's dangerous. We're seeing it in our line of work too, of course. And so I don't think I can say it better than Director Comey did. It is a problem at the DEA. It is a problem throughout law enforcement, and it's a problem throughout our intelligence community. It's something I worry about and something I see routinely.
Your predecessor previously addressed the situation with legalized marijuana when they were here. Can you give the subcommittee an update on how the actions of the states that how actions of those states has affected DEA and other law enforcement's ability to stem the tide of this drug? Does the DEA have the resources, or has it requested a budget request that's large enough to adequately help with the states surrounding Colorado and Washington?
Well, with respect to the budget request, I think the President's budget is good for DEA, and I would be thrilled to see it enacted as written for us. Do we have enough resources? Well, we've lost men and women over the last 5 years. I think I mentioned in my opening remarks, we're down about 860 people in the last 5 years. About 350 of them are special agents. So we don't have the resources we once did, and that's a problem. Not an insurmountable one if we do the following thing. And this is what I've told my special agents in charge around the country to do. Go out in your jurisdiction and work the biggest, most important cases you have, whatever it may be, and this will respond to your question, sir. In many cases, the biggest and most important cases are heroin, opioids, meth, synthetics, as Congresswoman Lowy mentioned. But I've also told my SACs, my special agents in charge, if your biggest and most important case is a marijuana case, go make it. Marijuana is illegal under federal law. I'm a law enforcement official, and I have no difficulty in supporting the men and women of DEA if those are the cases they're doing. None whatsoever. But the simple fact and the simple math of it is, in most of our jurisdictions, and you can see this in our National Drug Threat Assessment, it is ranked lower, of course, than heroin, opioids, synthetics, cocaine, and meth. Are we still making marijuana cases around the country? Absolutely. We're abiding by the memo that former Deputy Attorney General Cole issued in, I think, August of 2014. It might have been 2013. But where we have a big important case, go make it. If it happens to be marijuana, so be it.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We've got a series of votes coming up. Mr. Serrano has, do you want to ask a couple of questions? Sure. Mr. Serrano.
What Mr. Honda was speaking about, which one was that? For the, huh? Is that the same item that is being used by the New York City Police Department?
I don't know specifically what they're using, but there is a second name that's often Naloxone or Narcan.
I believe it is.
Yeah, and I think many.
Because my question would be, if that, such a large police department has seen fit to use it, why do we still have concerns about its usage?
Oh, I don't have concerns about its usage. I think it's a wonderful thing. And I love the fact that my DEA special agents are being trained to use it.
Right.
My point only was that they're also being trained
Side effects?
for possible side effects that attend the administration of it. So they're being trained on the administration of naloxone/Narcan, as well as CPR and the use of defibrillators.
Right. And my second and last question is, some years ago, about 15 years ago, the Cuban government was willing to have DEA, I think it went as far as stationed in Cuba, on Cuban soil, during the heat, you know, the top of the Cold War between us, in order to deal with the fact that some boats were landing in Cuban shore, and then from there using it to transport or make exchanges. And politics got in the way and that never happened. Has that been mentioned again without giving me any state secrets, or do you think there's an opening now for that to happen, perhaps?
They don't tell me any state secrets, Mr. Serrano, but it's certainly something that we ought to look at, given its proximity to our shores.
Right.
I would say, and I mean this colloquially, it's a bit of an intelligence gap, so we're going to keep our eye on Cuba. It is not presently a large transit country or source country.
Right,
But as you know, things can change,
right.
and so it's something we're certainly cognizant of.
Yeah, we know that they've been pretty strict about, you know, and come down hard on drug situations, but it just struck me that it was so incredible, Mr. Chairman, that they were willing to have DEA agents stationed in Cuba in order to deal with this, which was a problem to them and a problem to us. So if there's an opening under this new thing that is happening between the two countries, I think we should look at it again.
We will look at it, I promise you that, sir.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Robing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Administrator Rosenberg. And I just want to tell you personally how much I appreciate the time that you spent with me last week. You really educated me in a way that even after having served on this committee, I don't know that I fully could appreciate, despite the chairman of the full committee's commitment to a lot of these issues, and the fact that you are diligent, Mr. Chairman, and always ensuring that these are issues that are addressed, particularly because of your state and your district. I, however, didn't quite understand how it affected my own district or my own state, and so watched this on YouTube, but you directed me to this video chasing the dragon, and I hope everybody on this committee, if I may just be behind the ball, but watching that video really gave me a perspective, particularly as a mom with young kids, about how quickly someone's life can deteriorate from opioid use into heroin and then overdose. And hearing the one mother talk about the loss of her child, but also seeing a mother herself having lost control of her own life and losing her children in a different way was pretty remarkable for me. And so I just want to tell you, you know, how much I appreciate your commitment to these issues and shedding light on it in a way that we can all relate to. Because as I said to you in my office, unless you've had a family member or someone close to you go through an addiction, particularly in this case, opioid or heroin addiction, and either come out the other side in a positive way or lose their lives tragically, I mean, I certainly can say I can't speak with authority on this issue in any way, shape, or form. And so I think it's important for those of us who haven't experienced that to be able to have a glimpse into the lives of families who have been tragically affected by this in order to put faces behind the mission and the cause that we all on this committee and in the Congress are fighting to eradicate. And so just thank you for that. It really meant a lot to me to be exposed to this in a different way. You know, we spend a lot of time in these committees you know, reading facts from a sheet of paper or talking about things at a 30,000-foot level, but you really helped me personally drill down on this issue.
If I may, Congresswoman, first of all, it was a pleasure to meet you and spend time with you. I truly enjoyed that. Second, I don't believe you are behind the 8 ball or behind the times or whatever metaphor we want to use. Though I spent my career in federal law enforcement as an assistant U.S. attorney, as U.S. attorney in 2 different districts, and with 2 stints at the FBI, I had no idea until 10 months ago how bad this problem was. None. So please don't feel.
Yeah, well, that does make me feel a little bit better. But I did ask you for some information, and one of the things that struck me, there's one county in Alabama where the number of deaths related to heroin overdose grew from 58 in 2013 to 136 in 2014. Which, as you said, we use these words a lot, and we use them sometimes without the appropriate meaning, but that truly is stunning.
Stunning.
And so I appreciate, I mean, all of the things that my colleagues have already touched on were things that I wanted to talk to you about. I do want you to help us understand, as members of Congress who work on the federal level, how can we help you with the Take Back program? Because it's such a, we talk about rocket science in this room. That's not rocket science. That's how do we get these drugs out of people's medical cabinets so children or anyone doesn't have access to it. I mean, I don't know if I'm one of the 5,000 cities exist in my district, but I sure want to come up with a way to get cities in my district on the list to make it as easy as possible for people, including myself, to empty out the medicine cabinets of old unused pills. I think there's a way that all of us can use our mouthpiece on social media and other ways to be a part of that. I want you to help us figure out a way that we can play a role in that.
We would be delighted to work with your office or anybody's office here. This is a public good. It's one of the reasons I wanted to speak and was so privileged to be invited to the gathering that Chairman Rogers has in Atlanta. The more people who know about this stuff, the more people can help us publicize it. It is, like I said, an unmitigated good. So we'd be happy to touch base with your office. Can I also just give a shout out to the FBI, because we didn't produce Chasing the Dragon alone. We did it with them. It's a very powerful movie. We'll give copies to anybody who wants it. If you want to show it in your district, if you want your district directors to have it. Watch it first. As you know, Congresswoman, there's some rough language in there. Probably nothing that our kids haven't heard, but it's an important message.
It's great and it's rough, but rough doesn't even begin to describe the reality that these people go through. So again, thank you, and I know we're under time constraints, so I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Director, if we could recess briefly, and we will come back after the set of votes.
Thank you, sir.
hearing is back in, and I would recognize Mr. Palazzo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Rosenberg, thank you for taking the time to meet with us today. I commend the DEA for its efforts in the war on drugs. Drugs rip apart families and devastate communities. It doesn't matter if you're in one of our nation's largest cities or some backwoods town throughout rural America. Drugs find a way to establish a foothold that seems to never fully go away. I'm blessed to live on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. We've got beautiful beaches, great seafood, great fishing, awesome people. But we also have the I-10 corridor that stretches from the southwest border all the way to the eastern seashore, which is great for commerce, it's great for travel, tourism, but also it's a great way to traffic drugs in between locations. And so it does find its way into our community. And so with that, I would like you to discuss possibly the Gulf Coast high-intensity drug trafficking area and the DEA's partnership with state and local entities to block the flow of drugs flowing through the Gulf Coast region.
Certainly, Congressman. And what you're seeing in Mississippi, sadly, is being replicated everywhere in this country. It is an epidemic. Let me give you a little context, if I may. We have about 4,600 men and women who are special agents of the DEA. We have another 2,600 some odd task force officers. So they are literally, not just figuratively, but literally a force multiplier for us. Something like 35% of our law enforcement cadre are TFOs, state and local officers assigned to work with us on task forces around the country, including throughout the Gulf Coast. So it's enormously important. If I may add one other point about that, sir, the suspension in the equitable sharing program has caused some TFOs, the sky isn't falling yet, but some TFOs to drift away from our task forces, and it's something I worry about. And I hope we can get the equitable sharing program turned back on. But the task force environment, whether it's HIDA or OCDEF, is enormously important to our work and to our mission.
Well, thank you, and I hope we get the equitable sharing program back on as well, because I've heard from local law enforcement officers as well as district attorneys how important that is. Recently, the Commandant of the Coast Guard testified before Congress that we have actionable intelligence on 80 to 85% of known drug trafficking. But because of resource restrictions, we're only able to intercept and prosecute 20% of those occurrences. Biggest issues facing the Coast Guard is the lack of available ships. I'm a big proponent of catching the bad guys and the drugs before they actually make it into our backyard. So could you comment a little bit on the interagency partnerships that you have at the DEA specifically with the Coast Guard?
The Coast Guard is an important part of what we do, particularly with respect to their intelligence and interdiction work. Tremendous respect for them, and I will point out my dear departed father was a Coastie, so I've long admired the Coast Guard. Through our El Paso Intelligence Center, we have a number of intelligence community partners, state and local partners, and DoD partners, including the Coast Guard, that contribute to our mission and to our intelligence sharing. So I am enormously grateful, not just to the Coast Guard, not just for the experience they gave my dad as a young man, but what they do for our mission.
Well, so basically you would agree with me, if the Coast Guard had more ships, we could intercept more drugs before they came to the United States.
If we all had more stuff, we probably could do more with it. It's a challenge throughout government, as you well know. We try and make do with what we have.
Well, it's a serious issue, and again, drugs do rip apart families and communities, and which leads me into my last question, and I'll make it fast. Is what we're seeing in rural areas is the spread of methamphetamines and the production of methamphetamines. In fact, 17% of all drug convictions in the state are related to meth. In 2010, we tried to slow this growth down by looking at the precursors of meth manufacturing, and we basically required prescription for pseudoephedrine and ephedrine, and it's worked. It's slowed down. People still go to the bordering states, but we're capturing people that are going in and purchasing these precursors more. I think it's it's something that's going to devastate our entire nation. Can you tell me what is the DEA doing to basically combat meth production and use in rural communities around the United States?
We're trying to approach it, sir, the way we approach these other aspects of the drug epidemic. A lot of the meth that we see in the United States actually comes out of Mexico. Several years ago, we had a number of large clandestine labs in the U.S. producing meth. Most of the meth labs in the United States now are what we call one-pot labs, meaning very small with very small yields. We're seeing the precursor chemicals going into Mexico, into much larger labs, and then coming across our border. So again, it's probably threefold. It's attacking the supply. It certainly has connections to the diversion problem, and then it's that education, prevention, treatment, outreach component, the demand reduction. So we're throwing everything at it. It's a tough battle.
Well, I appreciate your testimony, and if I could ask one last question, since we're kind of sparse with members right now. What's the one thing that you wish you had that could make your job easier and that you could protect families and protect communities and protect our most valuable resource, our children, against the scourge of drugs today?
I wish I had a day where I could talk to everybody at once and they would listen to me. I know that sounds like a soft answer to a legitimate question. I struggle with how do we get this message out? Because I really don't think supply side law enforcement interdiction alone will win the day or do the trick. I feel like what I've learned in my 10 months at the DEA is both astonishing and frightening, and that if I could somehow convince people that we really, really do have an epidemic and tell them how it starts and where it goes, and I know it sounds like a soft answer, but that's what I would love to do. I'd love to have people listen to me just for a day. Seems unlikely.
Yeah, well, I hope more people listen, and thank you for your testimony. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Palazzo. In addition to DEA's appropriation, the committee provides over $500 million for drug task forces, OCD, ETF, which fund both investigative and prosecution costs to combat major drug organizations. Could you describe how ODC ETF, how that process works in comparison with the DEA's own task forces? And should the DEA, FBI, and other investigative agencies and U.S. attorneys get their money in their own accounts, or does in your opinion, does that ODC ETF process work well?
Strangely, Mr. Chairman, we just call that OCDF. I don't know quite how that word comes from those letters.
It's tough.
But the OCDF task forces are an important part of who we are and what we do. I do like the task force concept, whether it's OCDF or HIDA. I believe there are 12 OCDF task forces around the country. They're funded through the department, I believe. And I think 9 of the 12 are DEA-led. And when you look at the number of cases that we open, so OCDF, generally speaking, are our largest, most important cases. These would be transnational organized criminal gangs and the like, violent international cartels, and the unholy alliances that they have with street gangs in the U.S. So when you say OCDF, it's almost a synonym for our most important stuff. And of the OCDF cases that we opened in the last fiscal year, government-wide, something like 80%, I don't know the exact number, but I can get it for you, are DEA-led cases or DEA cases. So it's a big part of who we are and what we do. I like the concept, and it works well for us. And as I mentioned, 9 of the 12 OCDF task forces around the country are led by DEA agents. So it's a good vehicle for us. And these are important cases. I still don't know why we say OCDF, but
It's a tough one.
it's a tough one.
Should the DEA, FBI, and other agencies and U.S. attorneys get this money in their own accounts, or does the way it's currently set up work well?
I think the way it's currently set up works well. I'd have to give that a little more thought because I don't really know, and I haven't focused on that question, sir. So if you don't mind,
Not
I
at
would
all.
be happy to get back to you on that with some further thoughts.
Your request also calls for $7.5 million in additional staff to enhance internal cybersecurity and combat potential insider threats. Could you describe what these are and what the DEA is currently doing to address these challenges?
Yes, sir, and I'm pleased that the President's budget provides for that. Cybersecurity generally is so we can protect our stuff from the outside, from intrusions, and we've all seen far too many of those, sadly and unfortunately, targeted not just at government, but at private individuals and private sector companies. So we want to make sure that our systems are as secure as can be. The insider threat piece is a cousin to that. I want to make sure, because I was an assistant U.S. attorney in the Eastern District of Virginia, where Aldrich Ames, the CIA spy, was prosecuted, and where Robert Hansen, the FBI spy, was prosecuted, that our stuff is secure from an insider threat. I have wonderful men and women, but if one day one of them decides not to be so wonderful, if one day one of them comes in and wants to, copy all of our confidential source files to a thumb drive at 2 in the morning, I need to see that and I need to know about that. The most important resource we have is our people, and protecting them is paramount. But second to that, of course, it's our information. Our confidential source files, our investigative files, I can't lose that. And so I need to build a capacity internally, not to watch people through their bedroom windows, not to look in their bank accounts, but to know that if somebody is engaging in strange behavior, and by that I mean strange electronic behavior, I got to make sure my files are secure so that my people are secure. And the President's budget provides us money, I think, to do that.
Thank you. Mr. Honda.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator Rosenberg, as you know, many states are legalizing medical marijuana, and a few have legalized recreational marijuana. And it seems like our country's view on this has shifted a bit significantly in recent years. And at the same time, we're seeing a surge in costs, both in terms of lives and funding, due to the spike in opioid and heroin addiction. And I think it might be time to shift where we focus our enforcement resources. Do you think that it is time to have a conversation about rescheduling marijuana under the Controlled Substance Act? And from the perspective of DEA, would there ever be a circumstance where you would support rescheduling?
So under the Controlled Substances Act, Mr. Honda, something is put into Schedule 1, as marijuana currently is, if there's a potential for abuse, and if there is no recognized safe and effective medical use. And so if it turned out one day that there was a recognized safe and effective medical use, and I don't want to quibble over words, but I recognized I rely on the FDA for its science, then it could certainly be moved out of Schedule 1. But as long as those are the criteria for placement in Schedule 1, and as long as the FDA continues to tell me with their very good doctors and scientists that there is no recognized safe and effective medical use, I think it's properly classified. Now, I also take your point that conversation has shifted, but I'm a law enforcement officer.
I understand that.
It's illegal under federal law. I've told my special agents in charge to make the most important cases in their jurisdictions. Typically, that's not marijuana. Typically, that is heroin or opioids or synthetics or meth and the like. But I've also told them, as I mentioned earlier, where there is a significant marijuana case, where it's a violent cartel, where they're distributing to minors, where it meets the criteria of the Cole memo, go do it. It remains illegal under federal law, and my job is to enforce the law. I'm sorry for the long-winded answer.
No, it's fine. I think being in a position that you are, you have limited wiggle room in terms of upholding the law and following it. Asking for your opinion and getting a response like if there are scientific evidence that shows that there's some legitimate uses in medicine or in other arenas that the conversation probably should take place.
And I think that's fair. But I have to rely not on a vote or on public opinion, but on the science of the FDA. That's my guiding principle here. But I will say this, I think this is really important and sometimes gets lost in the debate, sir. The DEA has 469 individuals registered with us, with our permission, to do research on Schedule I controlled substances. Of those 469, I hope I'm getting my numbers right, 254 are researching marijuana and its constituent parts. We have never turned down a legitimate request for research on marijuana. If I break it down further for you, and it might make you feel a little bit better, 85 of those researchers are researching CBD, which may turn out to prove effective for treatment of certain illnesses, including possibly childhood epilepsy.
Yeah.
And another 17 of the researchers are actually working on smoked marijuana using human subjects. Completely and fully support research. We've got to do that. And in fact, we are making provisions to make applying for permits to do research easier. We've recently issued modifications, or I should say amendments, so that researchers who want to modify their work have an easier time of doing that. If we're going to be grounded in science, we have to support the work of scientists. And if it turns out that there's something in marijuana or marijuana itself that is effective against childhood epilepsy, I promise you I will be at the front of the parade leading the band.
No, I understand your response, and my brother was a federal parole officer, and you know, he had certain things he had to follow too. So
Yes, sir.
completely understand your response.
Yes, sir.
Another cut on this, in the final FY 2016 omnibus carried a medical marijuana language which prohibits DEA from preventing states from implementing their own laws that authorize the use, distribution, possession, and cultivation of medical marijuana. We've heard that of incidents where DEA and the Department of Justice are still pursuing these cases. Without commenting on specific cases, is it the policy of DEA to investigate any dispensaries operating under the state law? And is DEA disregarding the law that Congress passed?
I'm familiar with the provision. I think it was Section 538 of the Omnibus Bill, and I know it became an issue in a case out of the Northern District of California decided by Judge Breyer, United States versus Marin Alliance. So I'm certainly familiar with it. I am not a constitutional scholar, but nothing in Section 538 mentions the Controlled Substances Act, and so I don't think anything in Section 538 in any way undermines our federal law enforcement or civil enforcement authority under Section 538. Smarter people than me, and there are many of them at the Department of Justice, are noodling through this right now. I don't know Judge Breyer. I have great respect for the federal district judges of this country. I practiced in front of many, but I don't believe that his reading of Section 538 is right, and I think the department has taken an opposite view. I do know as a sort of a principle of statutory construction that if an act of Congress is not specifically, I think this is right, refuted, repealed by another act, and that there's some way to read them so that they live together peacefully, then they can. And I think that's what we have here, that we can continue to enforce federal law under the Controlled Substances Act. What we cannot do pursuant to that amendment, I believe, is prohibit the states from implementing their own regulations. So there are people far smarter than me at the department who can give you a better answer, but I don't see it as precluding our federal law enforcement work.
I think I followed your noodling.
Yeah, it was some significant noodling, so thank you for bearing with me.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Other questions, we'll just submit for the record to have you be able to answer in more detail.
I would be delighted.
Any further questions?
Well, a real quick one,
Sure.
if I may. This impact that the war on drugs has had on levels of incarceration in our nation prisons, both at the state and federal level. This has been a particularly harsh impact on minority communities, many of which have seen large segments of their population jailed for drug offenses. Criminal justice reform is currently being debated both in Congress as well as the legislatures across this nation. As we have those conversations, I think input from law enforcement is important to hear. So the question would be, is there a way to wage a smarter war on drugs? And I think you spoke a little bit about that in terms of priorities and how you would approach it. But is there a smarter way of approaching the war on drugs that still puts violent criminals in jail while doing a better job in rehabbing those who are low-level nonviolent offenders?
I think our 360 strategy gets at some of that, Mr. Honda, by also emphasizing education, prevention and demand reduction. But also, if we're doing our jobs right, and I've urged our special agents in charge to follow this edict, we have to do the biggest, most important cases in the country. We shouldn't be doing low-level drug offenders. We're not busting kids in their University of UCLA dorm rooms for smoking dope. We're going after big, violent international cartels and street gangs, that unholy alliance I spoke of earlier. And as long as we focus our work there, I think we're smart on crime.
Administrator Rosenberg, we deeply appreciate your service to the country. I'll have a number of other questions we will submit for the record. And again, we will do our very best in this tight budget environment to give you the support that you need so you can continue your important mission. We thank you so much for looking after the welfare of our kids and the country.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, it's a privilege. Thank you for having me here today.
Thank you very much, sir, and the hearing is adjourned.